organizing this webinar. And when you start anything for the first time, it should begin well. And to begin this whole thing, how can we think of a better speaker than Dr. Unnikrishnan? I had the privilege and fortune to be associated with him when he was teaching in Manipal, and I was also in Karnataka. I'm deeply impressed by his knowledge in a variety of subjects. He is a master in a variety of fields, including pharmacy, religion, agriculture, space, music, you just name it. And I'm really looking forward to listening to his presentation. And I promise all the participants that they are in for a great lecture. Now I request my colleague, Dr. Hema, to do the proper introduction, formal introduction, allow me to say this. Thank you. The people you see on the screen are our beloved secretary, Surabhi Vani Devi Madam, the daughter of former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu, and it is with her blessings that we are starting this today. And we are also helped and guided by the brilliant leadership of our director, young and dynamic Ajita Sekhar Madam. And now I request Hema Madam to do the introduction.
Also, thank you for all the warm words that you had for our first speaker. It yet remains my duty to formally present to you the elaborate profile in a condensed manner of our speaker for today, Dr. M.K. Unnikrishnan. Professor Unnikrishnan completed his B.Pharm from BITS Pilani in 1978 and PhD from Mangalore University in 1997. After a rich 33-year-old long teaching experience at Manipal College of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Sir is currently principal at National College of Pharmacy, KMCT Group of Institutions, Kozhikode, Kerala, where he teaches pharmacotherapeutics, pharmacology, and drug discovery. Professor Unnikrishnan has guided over 12 PhD students and few more to go, and has published about 200 articles in various peer-reviewed journals. Sir's prolific publishing is evident from his statistics of 1,539 Scopus citations, leading to an H index of 21 and 3,763 Google Scholar citations with an H index of 32. His major areas of interest are drug discovery, evolution, cognition, public health, and education. He presently holds 4 patents in his name. As a corollary of his interest in public health and also in writing, Dr. Unnikrishnan has penned articles in the Economic and Political Weekly, Health Policy and Planning, etc., discussing various contemporary socio-political problems in Indian healthcare, and he also contributes general articles to newspapers and magazines on these topics. Sir's most recent work in collaboration with Boston University, USA and University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia, titled Effects of Sedative Hypnotics on Sleep Quality Amongst Patients with Insomnia, Evidence from an Observational Pre-Post Study in India, was published in BMC Health and Quality of Life Outcomes. Professor Unnikrishnan is a member of the Society of Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health USA and publishes in his nascent disciplines. He is also an editorial board member of Scientific Reports, a Nature Group publication. Besides, Professor Unnikrishnan is a peer reviewer for several journals of international repute. With this brief introduction, which only presents some highlights of Professor Unnikrishnan's profile, I request Sir to kindly commence with his topic for today, Pharma Innovation in India, an overview. Also, just a small point for all our attendees, please feel free to post whatever queries you have for Dr. Unnikrishnan in the chat box, and we will, at the end of the talk, request Professor to take up at least some of them. Thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And can you please put up the slides? Dr.
Yes,
Hema
sir.
has
Yes, sir.
agreed
Yes,
to do
sir.
so.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And thank you for the flattering introduction, particularly the, Dr. Bhagavan Raju's very extravagant praise. Thank you. And I'm not an expert in many of those topics that he listed. Never mind. We shall proceed with what I have to do now. So uh, I thought, this is the COVID season. Everybody is bitterly upset with the lockdown and the extended lockdown. Things have come to a standstill. And I think only a miracle can save India into its, earlier economic glory. And it's going to take months and years probably. And I thought this is the season for entrepreneurs to come out and do something for the country. So, in fact, there's a very famous quote by Dr. Kalam. Somebody asked him, "How is it that you can solve the unemployment problem in India?" And he said, "It's very simple. All of you become employers, and the problem is solved." So, this I thought is an important time to consider our entrepreneurial spirit. India has a tremendous amount of it. India is quite creative. And contrary to what is believed, there's a lot of potential in India. And before I begin, let me acknowledge Dr.M.D. Nair. I happened to read a book of his, 50 years in the Indian pharmaceutical industry. That's what has given me the bulk of the material. I also thank my colleague, Akash is very constantly supplying me with very, very insightful comments, articles. He's annotating them. He's send me books, soft copies. Also, of course, Dr. Bhagavan Raju for giving me this opportunity, without which all this would have been wasted. And also the topic of this lecture and its treatment has been partly shaped by discussions with Dr. Hema Nair of SVCP. And let me also thank in advance the viewers who might be listening to me. Now, coming to the next slide, can you please change the slide, please? Yeah. I first start with some disclaimers. I'm not an expert in this field, okay? So please take my advice with a little bit of a supplementary reading. My impressions are based on limited reading and nearly 4 decades of teaching. It's passive learning, of course. I have tried to be objective, but please do not accept my version as final. You have to do your own reading to discover your own truth. A lot of what I say would be subjective, would be considered probably scandalous by some people. But I would still say it because it is important for us to look at what's going wrong, and only then can we set right the issues that we face today. Next slide, please. Now, why is a pharma innovation review right now very important? The pandemic has thrown open many questions fundamental to our survival, and students and young teachers need to look back at our own past to get inspired. See, India has not been so bad. If you look back and check, you'll find that India has done quite a lot of work in spite of being quite ignorant about it. Even as teachers, we have done very little reading to understand our own past. And India has famously ignored history. And the students, if they understand the context of success and failure, it would drive ambition, inspire self-worth and confidence. And India today needs a confident generation, especially in this critical season where things are going bad for us. We need leaders, we need innovators. And these innovators and entrepreneurs are going to take the country forward. And I thought this lecture is primarily for them, for those who might like to contribute to bring them confidence. Next slide, please. Now, before I begin, I would like to start with a pre-test. I have listed only 2 questions because I was not sure whether I should list the third question. The first question is, name some drugs developed in India and was marketed. Name some pharma industries that set up labs before independence. And the third question, which I have not listed there, is what I would like to also add. What drives pharma innovation? Is it science or is it commerce? I think this is the most important question which I have not listed. The reason for not listing it is many people would find this question a little unhappy and unpleasant, because the fact is that pharma innovation is driven primarily by commercial interest rather than science by itself. And this is the purpose of my talk. And I would like to explain to you, the people who are listening to me, how much commerce matters, how much the finances, the economic review, how many situations matter. And today more than ever, these issues have come to the forefront. So in this context, I would like you to understand these issues of uh, innovation in the context of reality as presented to us by the world in general. Next slide, please. I hope I can be heard. Everybody can hear me, I hope. Okay, so it's widely believed that India has done nothing much in drug discovery. Yes, it is probably true, because if you check the medical dictionary, you may not find many terms from India. Almost nothing, you would say. In fact, when the WHO wanted to see what India can do to contribute towards development of new drugs for neglected diseases, they approached a professor of economics in IIM Kolkata. One Professor Sudeep Chowdhury was contacted, and he is the one who wrote the report. Now observe this phenomenon. The WHO addressing this question by looking at what a professor of economics has to say from IIM Calcutta. So this study was commissioned by WHO, and it was probably because the IPR issues come to the forefront whenever you talk about innovation in drugs. It is true, IPR is the greatest and the most contentious issue whenever innovation is spoken about. And these issues are rarely addressed or discussed by teachers like us, and need to be discussed, because that's what actually presents the reality in greater light. Okay, next question, please. Now, if you look at the list, next one, please. The next slide has, now there are two slides now. The table 3 provided by Sudeep Chowdhury is a list of drugs developed in India. Is that okay? Now, he starts with ureastabamine, methaqualone, hamicin, centimizone, and so on and so forth. And then he talks about the year of introduction, the use, the institution that brought it out, and the marketing status. Now, if you look at the extreme right, you will find very little of what has been done in India is now available in the market. So in other words, the visible part of innovation is all about what is present in the market. And here you will agree that India has not done much to the market. India has not created products that thrive in the market. And that's finally what benefits mankind, benefits Indians or the world. So it is important to understand that the Amit Chowdhury, the economic point of view, is more important for our, Sudeep Chowdhury, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Next slide, please. It continues. The table 3 continues into the next slide. And the next slide is all about chandonium iodide. Remember, chandonium iodide is the only drug that has been created by a university in India. CDRI is, and Chandigarh together contributed to this drug. And Dr. Harkishan Singh is famous for his contribution in this direction. Art ether, there are so many. Some of them are available, but the bulk of what India has done, what India has innovated, do not ever reach the market. So the moral of the story is that it is not the science, but the expression of scientific discoveries in its market setting is what finally makes a product useful. Now you look at the sources, it's all this material by Sudeep Chowdhury has been picked up from the annual reports of CDRI, then by Nityanand's papers, and so many other papers. And he agrees that some diagnostic aids, etc., have been omitted. Well, that's beside the point. Next slide, please. So, if you look at the previous two slides, you completely miss one of the most important contributions from India, which is recipe. I had given a talk on this some 2-3 sessions before at some other college, where I discussed the contribution from India in making Reserpine an important drug. But Sudeep Chaudhary does not mention it. Quite rightly so. I cannot blame him for that, because Reserpine was not technically contributed by India. The molecule Reserpine didn't come from India. It's only Rauwolfia serpentina, the Sarpagandha plant, that India contributed. But even then, it is patently unfair that no credit is given for our contribution in Sarpagandha extracts, because it's been used for centuries in India. Rustam Vakil, moreover, did the first clinical trial and showed to the world that Reserpine lowers blood pressure. The isolation of Reserpine was inspired by Vakil's work, the clinical trial. And remember, Acharya Sir Prafulla Chandra Roy's Bengal Chemicals was selling in millions Ralphen, the tablet for blood pressure. When, remember, hexamethonium like horrors were being used in the West. Next slide, please. Now, the forgotten contributions from this Indian contribution in Reserpine, if you want, you must read a paper by, I think it is Pradipta Roy. Yes, you must read a paper by Pradipta Roy. He published in an Indian Journal of Psychiatry, if I'm not mistaken. And interestingly, the study by Roy was funded by the Wellcome Trust. That's again interesting. That shows how much we neglect research, and it has to come from the contribution abroad. Well, the work on Rauwolfia began before Ramnath Chopra. Ramnath Chopra is considered the father of pharmacology, and generally Indian contributions is generally literature begins with the paper by Ramnath Chopra. It is not true. Mahatma Gandhi was a regular user. In 1931, 2 years before Ramnath Chopra published his paper, Kartik Chandra Bose and Gananath Sen had already published the first major scientific paper on Reserpine in a journal. And Salimuzzaman Siddiqui of Aligarh Muslim University had extracted some of the compounds from Rauwolfia. He failed to extract Reserpine, but that doesn't mean there wasn't an inquiry, there wasn't any scientific inquiry into the use of Reserpine, the use of Rauwolfia and how it comes about to be helping in blood pressure. Next slide, please. Now, even the contribution of Reserpine in psychiatry, in schizophrenia, etc., was inspired by India. Not only blood pressure. And remember, New York Times reported a medical conference in Gujarat where Ayurvedic medicines with ECT provided an 80% recovery in schizophrenia, which was unknown in those days. And Rustam Vakil's paper had already been published, so they knew about Rauwolfia serpentina's effect on BP. And SIBA had already isolated Reserpine and was already selling it as Serpacil, which actually became a big important medicine in the West for blood pressure. And Nathan Klein did a trial of Reserpine on schizophrenia and got excellent results. And that is how Reserpine followed chlorpromazine by just a gap of 2 years. We had two brilliant drugs, chlorpromazine and Reserpine, which changed the attitude towards psychiatric illnesses. It changed the manner in which psychiatric illness was treated from custodial and institution-based therapy to a psychopharmacotherapeutic approach. This historic transition occurred because of reserpine. A contribution from India may not be the molecule, but the idea came from India. But if you look at Sudeep Chowdhury's paper, you don't find a mention of reserpine. The reason is that the reserpine is the drug and not Raolfia or the idea of blood pressure lowering by the plant. It is not the idea that matters. What matters truly is that you have a product in the market, and that's what makes innovation important. So these are the lessons. Now look at that. The importance of reserpine goes further. It produces so many Nobel Prizes. Carlson got a prize for understanding the biology of reserpine. You know, the monoamine hypothesis was a result of the work in reserpine. Woodward won a Nobel Prize for synthesizing reserpine. Of course, he synthesized on many other molecules too, so you cannot say it's only for reserpine. But what about the Lasker to Vakil? It's the first time an Indian won a Lasker award. Lasker is supposed to be a forerunner for the Nobel Prize in USA. All this has been highlighted because they're all associated with the molecule reserpine, the product, the marketed product of Surfazil in the West. And Siddiqui's contribution is less than a footnote in history. Why? The reason is that I told you science dominates medicinal purpose. I'm sorry, the commercial success of medicine. So science is incidental and commerce is important. That's how it is to be understood when you look at pharmaceutical innovation. And the purpose of this lecture is primarily to understand this issue of how little science matters. Okay, now next slide, please. Now, the next slide probably would shock you because, you know, the Westerners considered India pre-scientific. Raulfia is pre-scientific. All of Indian Ayurveda, even today, is considered pre-scientific. Now, what is this pre-scientific? The word pre-scientific means that we have not yet entered a scientific domain. Well, but if you look at the horrendous remedies for BP and psychiatric disorders in those days, like malaria therapy, which won a Nobel Prize, leucotomy, that is, you slice and remove the frontal lobe, remove the connections with the frontal lobe, prefrontal lobe, and you cure psychiatric disorders. That was considered. Insulin coma, pentylene tetrazole, a terrible convulsant. All this was practiced in those days. In fact, there's a very famous story about how John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary Kennedy, was forced to undergo a frontal, the lobotomy, after which she was permanently disabled. She couldn't speak. So these horrendous pre-scientific remedies were okay because they were in the West. But Indians who used reserpine and who showed the world that reserpine is useful still remain pre-scientific and unknown. So these disparities I want you to understand, and a little dose of patriotism is important to, you know, feel confident about oneself. And I would also like you to think that the BP medicines were no less horrifying. Now, if you just look at the next slide, please, you will see, next slide, is the hexamethonium man. Now, this hexamethonium man is an excerpt from a medical book, a pharmacology book of the old times. It's very famously quoted. Actually, it comes from a paper by Peyton in Pharmacological Reviews in 1954. Okay, and you just read it. It's horrifying. The kind of remedies that people tolerated for BP. He's pink complexioned, except that when he has stood for a long time, he gets pale and faints. His handshake is warm and dry. He is placid, relaxed. He's placid and relaxed. He may laugh but cannot cry. Your rudest story will not make him blush, and the most unpleasant circumstances will fail to make him pale. His socks and collars stay very clean. He wears corsets to compress his splanchnic vascular pool. He is fidgety to keep Venus returned from his leg. He dislikes speaking unless he moistens his dry mouth and throat. You see, This is the kind of horrifying side effects a person suffered for taking medicines for BP in those days. Now, if you look at the last part, one is uncertain how he will end, but perhaps by eating less and less and getting older and colder and colder, he will sink into a symptomless hypoglycemic coma and die. A sort of entropy death. This is how he, very sardonically presents the exametonium man. And remember, it was in such a season that India contributed reserpine for the blood pressure patients. And yet, India is considered pre-scientific. And the reason is quite obvious. You'll have seen that Sudeep Chowdhury has omitted this contribution from that list because India did not contribute the final marketed product. So please understand that medicines are first a marketed product and then a product of science. Next slide, please. So this is primarily the lesson that I want you to go back with. On closer examination, you would realize that drug discovery and drug development are two different things. Converting a medicine to a saleable commodity is a challenge for poor countries. Our poor economic status notwithstanding, India is the world's pharmacy today, and we are quite proud of that. The pharmacy schools that we train students for, they're all, providing them some employment, and India is definitely one of the biggest contributors of generic medicines today. And the vaccine for COVID also would need India's support, because finally India is one of the biggest producers of vaccines all over the world. So all this has happened, but why is India famous today for pharmacy? Because we have contributed to the market. Why is Indian contribution not so famous in the? Because they have not reached the market. So remember, it's the market that drives fame. It's the market that drives the, the quality of innovation. And these things I want you to understand. Next slide, please. Now, look at the Amit Chowdhury report once again. He lists 3 ways of pharma innovation: developing new chemical entities, modifying new chemical entities, and new processes for new chemical entities. Now, India has resorted to the last, new processes, and India has done marvelously well. In non-infringing patents, we have been able to produce. Of course, now we are covered under the product patent, but this was very valuable in the 1970s when we switched to the process patent. And it is in this process patent mastery that India grew in pharmaceutical innovation. So it's again because we captured the market that we are important. It's because of the market, it's because of the commercial implications that India has learned to apply itself in the proper direction. And early in the Indian investment in drug discovery was focused on CSR labs like CDRI, and you also know that they have not been very successful because they did not finally yield commercially viable products, as we have already seen by Amit Chowdhury's discourse. Next slide, please. Now, the pharma innovation is primarily driven by corporates. This is true. Now, the pharma innovation is also historically a corporate initiative. Okay. Now, and CDRI, etc., are just experiments, just aberrations in history, where a government tries to do something through public sector enterprises for new drug development. Drugs developed by CDRI were licensed to Indian companies. Very few survive in the market. You have already seen Amit Chowdhury's report. No CDRI innovations have been registered in developed countries. And very few have been successful. None of them have been commercially very successful, except probably methaqualone, which earned more notoriety for its addicting ability than the other medicines that India has contributed. And I told you the contribution, the true contribution from India probably in reserpine is completely forgotten. It's not even mentioned, as I have already explained to you. Next slide, please. So Amit Chowdhury says it's probably because CDRI has no commercial orientation. Now comes the admission of the commercial interest. It is difficult to succeed in the market without MNCs. CDRI did not tie up with MNCs. Nor did CDRI develop alternate institutional marketing outlets for the medicines they produce. After TRIPS came into force, these the R&D forces which MNC set up in India are also winding up. Okay, they wound up rather. And very little tokenism is probably what you can express here. And TRIPS has enhanced the R&D efforts in India in a different direction. Indians develop drugs and license it out to MNCs abroad. So even if a drug is developed in India, India has realized that we cannot create a medicine out of it in the market. So send it abroad, sell it to some big company who can make a product out of it. So finally, the commercial interest today, we have realized that we cannot take a lead in that, and we are outsourced. Now, this is what is happening to Glenmark and so many other institutions. Next one, please. So early pharma innovation from India, the government effort about CSIR, we already know. They have not produced much. Now, there have been also private ventures. SIBA Research Center in 1963, which was closed in, I think, 85. Hext, which was sold to Piramal. Boots, which was again subsequently closed. These are the three early ventures of the MNCs who set up R&D units in India with the hope of producing something interesting. Now, you will just come to realize that it is not scientific indiscipline or scientific incompetence that led to the downfall of all these research ventures, but it's purely a commercial failure. And that's going to be the rest of the talk. I'll explain to you, next slide please, the SIBA story as told by Dr.M.D. Nair in his book, chapter 4 and 5 from his book, 50 Years in the Indian Pharmaceutical Industry. It's a read, it's a must read for all of you. I really would recommend, I can show the book to you. It's right here on my table. Can you, here it is. It's a book which I think libraries at least should buy, because it gives a very good insight into what we can do to at least diagnose the problem, if not solve the problem. Now, the SIBA story is interesting for many reasons. See, it was set up in 1961. It was conceived rather by Robert Capelli. See, Robert Capelli was a very different type of person. He was an Indophile. He traveled extensively in India. He was also a brilliant painter. In fact, a lot of his sketches are available in a book. He made extensive sketches of India and he loved India. He imbibed the multicultural, multi-ethnic diversity of India, and he also met Morarji Desai, the finance minister of India, and they used to exchange a lot of letters. They have been compiled and published too. And in 1963, SIBA Research Center opens in Goregaon, Bombay, and M.D. Nair calls it a gesture of commitment and gratitude to Morarji Desai towards SIBA and Robert Capelli, who was on the on the SIBA side. Now, next slide, please. Now, the SIBA Research Center, Capelli knew will succeed. The reason is he thought India has enormous talent, and he has met many of these talented scholars in reputed universities abroad. So he knew it's just a matter of calling them back to India and asking them to take over the research in SIBA Center in Goregaon. And he thought they would readily return and contribute. And Capelli also started a joint venture, SIBATUL, with Atul Limited, and they manufactured dye stuffs. So the SIBA research unit, from Capelli's fancies, in fact, I would say that the SIBA research unit was born more from Capelli's fancies and less on a thorough financial viability analysis. So this has been also the reason why he could not defend its continuation towards the end when things changed. Next slide, please. Now, in a 90-acre plot in Goregaon, 90 acres in Mumbai, remember, is an enormous land. Capelli puts Egbert Wettstein in charge and built a huge lab with all the facilities. In fact, there's a story about how they disposed the chemical abstracts when the center wound up. Handpicked 24 scientists from UK, US, and Switzerland, all top educated, very well established people, and focused on therapeutics and novel dyestuffs. But the problem Dr. M.D. Nair says is that there were too many therapeutic areas to be considered. The portfolio was too large. That was a problem, he says, and like the parasitic and bacterial infections, CVS disorders, CNS disorders, metabolic disorders, inflammation, diabetes, and so on and so forth. So it was a bit too vast for the limited manpower at their disposal in Goregaon. Next slide, please. Now, SIBA Research Center was an influential institution. In fact, it was even inaugurated by Pandit Nehru. Pandit Nehru inaugurated, probably because of a special reason. Vijayalakshmi Pandit was the governor of Maharashtra in those days. And Gautam Sahgal, Vijayalakshmi Pandit's son-in-law, Nayantara Sahgal's husband, was the managing director of SIBA. That was an additional reason. And Capelli's indophilic temper was fitly matched by top-notch connections with the ruling elite. And that's how, Nehru was brought in to inaugurate the SIBA lab. So you can just imagine what a glorious beginning it had. And they had the best people also. A grand international symposium followed the inauguration in which 3 Nobel laureates have participated. They were probably not all Nobel laureates at that time, but they did become Nobel laureates later. Alexander Todd, Robert Woodward, and Prilog. They were all, just imagine in those days, in 1963, India could attract such a lot of talent. And it was primarily because of Capelli's personal affection for India and Morarji Desai's enthusiastic support. Well, whatever the reason, it was possible to set up a first-rate institution. Now continue. Next slide, please. Now, the high-quality research outcomes were also possible because a galaxy of scientists joined. And they enjoyed proximity to the most developed labs with great thinkers in each discipline. And P.R. Govindachari, again trained in USA, in Illinois, he was the director. They also established a unit for clinical trials in KEM hospital. And during the inaugural address, Nehru said, if I were inclined to do science, I would have loved to work in a lab such as the one set up in Bombay by SIBA. So that goes to show how much care and attention Capelli paid to the setting up of a world-class research facility. And let's see what happens out of it. Next one, please. Next slide. So the drug discovery at SIBA Research Center was, of course, anticipated to be world-class. It was mostly empirical, random screening. That was a style in those days. Very little rational drug discovery was there in those days. New synthetic molecules, there were very good synthetic chemists there. Dr. Nair compound, an antitussive, was one of the first to get patented. Okay, and he says in those days, patenting was quite unusual for Indians. It was not even considered as a possibility. In fact, it doesn't stop with that. Dr. Nair also talks about a landmark, GO2998, a molecule by SIBA scientists Joy, David, and Grewal, which turned out to be the first ever catecholamine reuptake inhibitor. So it was a first-in-class medicine which was identified in the SIBA lab of Goregaon in early 60s. So you can imagine such was the kind of innovative ability that an Indian lab could command in those days. And it even successfully concluded that phase 2 clinical trials, but was later abandoned. In fact, SIBA thought it was too futuristic. There were no such drugs. And a first-in-class drug was always considered a big risk because God knows how it would be shot down in the market. And SIBA instead favored the beaten track by propping up another tricyclic antidepressant. So actually, it was a bus that they missed. It could have easily turned out into a first-in-class medicine, and it was possibly Eli Lilly's Prozac which created history later. If SIBA had taken pains to, run the risk, then they would have probably had this privilege of bringing to the market the first reuptake inhibitor. So which made history and is one of the all-time blockbusters now known to the world. Next slide, please. Now, remember, the SIBA Research Center in Goregaon was completely under the High Command in Basel. And they did exactly as dictated by the whims of the headquarters. The productivity, remember, Dr. M.D. Nair takes pains to explain this point. The productivity was at par, if not better than the Basel unit or the Ardsley unit in USA. So they were at par in terms of pharmaceutical innovation. The output was great in terms of patents or publications, everything. The portfolio was too heavy despite that, beyond the reach of the limited manpower. And yet they performed. The Indians were regularly sent to parent unit for training. In fact, they were representing a very, very elite set of scientists with all the access to the best in the West. And it was the best equipped lab in India, without doubt. Many of them in SIBA actually moved out to create a research culture in India. In fact, the SIBA was some kind of a seeding pot to bring in a lot of innovation later when many research labs opened up in India. Next slide, please. Now, SIBA Research Center was equal to its peers, at par with international peers in patents, publications, preclinical trials, clinical trials. Also was respected globally for good performance. But many molecules that passed the clinical trials and got the regulatory approval in India were not taken up by the parent company. Not very sure why that was the case. None of these molecules were put into the market. Dr. Nair mentions a commercial reason behind it, but does not explain what exactly are the commercial reasons. Probably we shall understand as the lecture proceeds. Next slide, please. SIBA Research Center also paid for its operation. It's not that it was financed from abroad. SIBA was financed by its own earnings from India. Except for some equipment which was supplied from there, the research in SIBA, research by SIBA in India had to pay for both capital and revenue costs. The value of research outcomes could be repatriated, but not the profits, monetary profits, because of RBI regulations. And this was considered the opportunity they had in SIBA, and yet they did not do this for some reasons. Well, probably we can come to know as the slides move. Next slide, please. And then came problems in a heap. Okay. The first thing is the cost of research went up. This strained the local funding of research as they had to meet all the expenses, revenue and capital. Once the cost went up, they found it difficult to finance. The rapid changes in economic climate in the country also changed their prospects. Curbs and controls on repatriation of profits by foreign companies, the Hathi Committee report, the drug price control order, the post-Indochina war crisis, and the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. All these together came up. So it was a politically volatile time with a lot of legislative upheavals that India went through. And together they all created a dent in the feasibility of running the SIBA Center for long. The last straw that broke the camel's back was the Indian Patents Act 1980, the amendment in which the product patent was annulled and the process patent became a replacement. And many multinationals opted to pull out of India at that time. In fact, they did this despite the enormous market potential in India. The rest, of course, a lot of it is known to you in history. But remember, these are all issues which further added. Now, remember, even the pharma industries were going through an uncertain time. As I mentioned, they are all also governed by commercial reasons more than innovative ability. The merger between SIBA and Geigy, which happened to be in the same year as 1970 when the patent rules changed, that created a lot of havoc in the upper echelons of the company. The merger redefined the company's aspirations, policies, and priorities. And there was also a greater need, as the management felt, for centralizing the R&D efforts, and the product range of SIBA and Geigy had to complement each other. So the superfluous elements were all shelved. Parasitic infections, TB, protozoal infections, they became low revenue options because they belonged to the poorer countries. And these actually changed the research priorities. And the Capelli team had by then retired. That was another problem. And Fon Planta of Geigy called the shots. And Geigy had a short-term bottom line, and R&D was pushed to the margins. So these are the events that precipitated in the closure, which we shall come to in the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, the disbanding of the SIBA Research Center was the final outcome of all these problems that Dr. Nair lists so beautifully in his book. His book is a very good case study to understand how India should venture in research, what we should pay attention to before we invest in innovation, especially pharmaceutical innovation, the kind of innovation. Let's quote Dr. Nair directly. It was felt that the investment in R&D in SIBA Research Center in Goregaon met entirely from revenues generated by the Indian subsidiary. By international standards was subcritical. The efforts and therapeutic areas became irrelevant to global market opportunities. See, look at that. Global market opportunities. That's the bottom line. So finally, it's all about financial viability rather than creativity in science. Dyestuffs group fell first. All the staff and scientists were sent away without meaningful compensation, he says. And to quote Dr. Nair, what has disturbed many of us was the way it was done, with all our scientific departments of the government silently watching the disappearance of perhaps the first ever fully integrated research center for drug discovery and for development of novel dyestuffs set up in India. It's a very nice chapter, 2 chapters, 4 and 5. You must read in Dr. Nair's book. It's very educative, and it also gives you an idea to introspect on our own systems, our own methods in our innovation. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to add to this issue about financial viability, commercial success, by quoting another episode from the report by Sudeep Chowdhury, which we already discussed. And that is about the Cipla's effort in Kelfar. Actually, it's from the same WHO report that Sudeep Chowdhury submitted to WHO. Now, Cipla's Kelfar was introduced in 1995. Now, let's come into the history of it. Actually, it's deferriprone, an iron chelator for thalassemia patients. And the NCE, that is the new compound, the research compound, was developed by the UK people, Robert Hilder and George Conto Girgis. So these people in 1983 brought the molecule into the market. Sorry, not did not into the market, into the company, into the research unit. Phase 1 and early phase 2 was already carried out in UK and Switzerland. And since Novartis owned desferrioxamine, that was the only iron chelator in the market. So they didn't want to send this off and start on this new one. So Novartis bought the patent for teferiprone and sat on it. That is, now you look at how patents can also be purchased and smothered. You know? So Novartis bought the patent and sat on it because they had another compound in the market already. And Novartis had bought this patent from the National Research Development Corporation of UK, not probably to develop it. And Hamid, Cipla's Hamid, learned about it through his manager, whose son was thalassemic. And Cipla approached George Conto-Girgis for help. Readily assented because Novartis was not keen on promoting the molecule. So George came down to India and helped Cipla to market this product. Next one, please. So the Kelfar, the product of the new product from Cipla, had some advantages. Kelfar was orally active, whereas the desferrioxamine needed a slow subcutaneous injection that lasted 8 to 12 hours, very cumbersome. And Kelfar was cheaper too. Side effects were perhaps matched: neurotoxicity versus agranulocytosis and neutropenia. Cipla directly sold Kelfar if blood counts were satisfactory. That was a strategy. But next slide, please. Kelfar failed. Cipla could not effectively promote Kelfar in the market, not because of safety concerns. When a drug is approved in India, people ask the question, where else is it approved? And that's when Cipla was cornered. It was not approved elsewhere. So people feel unsure about a drug approved in India alone. Cipla had a tough time getting approval for Kelfar, and George Conto-Girgis had to be flown to Delhi to impress the drugs controller. Next slide, please. So the lessons from SIBA, the lessons from Kelfar, if you consider these things, they're all lessons to reflect on the viability of Indian pharma R&D. SIBA Research Center is not an isolated case. Hext, Boots, Bayer, Procter & Gamble, SKF, Astra, BASF, Hindustan Lever, all of them had their units, R&D units, which closed down for similar reasons. All parent companies were research-based innovators with the best connections. But their Indian operations not only failed to integrate with global efforts, Indian R&D received suboptimal support, both human and capital, and never became part of the mainstream R&D strategy. They all turned redundant in due course, and the 1970 Patent Act was not the only reason. That's what the Amit says. Even I think Dr. Nair says, even after India became TRIPS compliant, there has been very little progress. So it is not only the TRIPS compliance and all that. It's not just regulatory affairs. It's not just intellectual property. It's also the possibility that India cannot really function. Next slide, please. Big players are trusted. Now take the Pliva case. Now drugs developed by the third world will be suspect. Dr. M.D. Nair speaks of how innovations fail. Okay, even Amit gives this example. Now Pliva, a Croatian company, developed azithromycin in 1970s. Pliva failed to market its product, entered into a license agreement with Pfizer for global sales, and Zithromax was among the largest selling products in 2003. It sold 1.8 billion worth medicines. So the labels matter, not just the medicine. So as you see, it's always the market that decides the success of the product. Next one, please. Now, there is this lingering self-doubt. None of the drugs developed in India have been marketed globally. Despite Ciba, Hex, Boots, and other companies having R&D units, Ciba had an R&D lab that was as productive as its peers. Ciba had even made cetirizine and owed that to India, but chose to ignore their own molecules from India. All the R&D outfits by MNCs were wound up. And similarly, CDRI also made several NCs. Very few were marketed. None of them succeeded. None of the CDRI drugs have found a place elsewhere, except methaqualone, more infamous than famous, for reasons, of course, which I will discuss in another lecture probably. Next slide, please. So this is not exclusive to drugs, but also devices and technology. Dr. Nair explains. See, MD Nair registers a company in South India, Drugs and Devices, SID, and SPIC Pharma agreed to undertake marketing. IDBI provided a loan, and SID developed a heart-lung machine with Dr. Valitan's active support. At the pre-launch meeting, offered a 35 to 40% cheaper product as compared to the cheapest machine which can be bought from abroad. And the cardiac surgeons were very, very appreciative. They all hailed the decision to make an Indian product, and import substitution was claimed as a great achievement. And finally, when the product was in the market, the reception was lukewarm. This Dr. M.D. Nair personally explains the reason. Next slide, please. So what is the reason? Why the lukewarm response? Patients preferred imported devices. The Made in India label created doubts about quality. Nothing succeeds like success, you know that, isn't it? So India has not succeeded and therefore cannot succeed is the thought that we nurse within us, you know, the suspicion, the worry. Also, change to the newer CABG techniques, the beating heart technique, also played a role in their, the device failing in the market. India has transcended international boundaries in the pharma generic markets, but we have yet not earned a reputation because prejudices still rule us. And a recent study by our own group, we had done a study recently, and we found that even the insulin analogs produced by Indian companies in India are not considered by Indian doctors. They prefer the imported analogs. In spite of paying a bigger price, they still promote prescription of companies. And remember, this Biocon product is approved in Japan. That's another story. So it's not that it's got a quality problem. It is just that our own perceptions are negative with our own ability to do something of quality. So this is a lingering problem in India, and I want you all to go home with this message that drug discovery is not just science. Drug discovery is also, and quite dominantly so, a commercial interest, of commercial interest. And that's when we need entrepreneurs to take over. Scientists alone cannot do. And this is the need of the hour, especially in the prevailing situation. We need entrepreneurs who can take us to the stage where Indian innovation would be trusted abroad and seen as a genuine, move forward. I think that's all I have to say, and I would like you all to read this topic. Thank you very much for the time you have spent with me. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, I'll be very happy.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I'm still, in that beautiful story that you wove around the history of how innovation in India has been sort of there, but in a suppressed form. And somehow, in all my readings, I always thought somewhere the Patent Act, which of course did enhance our manufacturing capacities a lot, but it was somewhere responsible for stifling innovation. But I think there are many more, like you put it, there's so many more reasons, sir, probably to why we didn't get as innovative as we could have. You put the story of Siba so beautifully, right from the glorious beginning, with all those intricate stories about how Prime Minister Nehru came over to inaugurate it and leading the way to the downfall. So I think the stories were inspirational and disheartening in equal measures. And it was really a class. It was we really, I'm sure we are all in this room and we enjoyed the talk immensely. It was really very nice. Even the ironical examples of how Cipla and even Biocon's insulin is accepted, the insulin story, it's accepted everywhere, but we don't trust our own medicine. So I think there is a lot of messages here which the young professionals who are going to enter the field, they might be future entrepreneurs, they might be drug discoveries for India, and they should take home a lot of messages. Sir, there is also this, that there are a lot of Indian companies who are now into drug discovery, but towards the end, when they reach the development stage, at some point they outsource it. They out-license it. They out-license it and thereby sweep all our innovation under the carpet.
Yeah, that's true. See, actually, there is another talk required if you want to. I would like to do that as well. How the complete clinical story is distorted in favor of the industry. You must read Ben Goldacre's book. The Bad Pharma. See, there is a lot of scandal to all this. See, please, let's not accept, what's public perception is not always true. And I'm telling you, there is enormous amount of deception, fraud. I would like to use the word fraud. At least there's deception, statistical deceptions. Then there's plenty of misrepresentation in literature. A lot of what is unpleasant is not published. So just by silencing certain people, you can promote, give an impression of hubris.
Yes, sir.
Anything else?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, there are a few more questions. Sir, we did not get to see the book, sir. If you could show it once again, because, yeah. Shweta?
That's because, now here is the book. Please, I would very much welcome. I can send you the link. Can you see it now?
No, sir. 1 minute.
I can't see my own screen.
Can you pin, sir, Shweta? I think keep sir pinned. Sir is taking the...
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
You see?
Not yet, sir.
Oh, upside.
Yeah, just a moment, sir.
Now can you see?
It's up, sir. Now it's upside down.
Okay. Yeah. Now?
Yeah. Oh, yes, sir. Oh, yes. Now we can see. Because I think, a lot of the youngsters should go through this book. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this book is, please remember, I have discussed only 2 chapters from this book.
Okay.
You need many times to get to the depth of it. Is a very good happen in India in this pharmaceutical innovation. This lockdown I have devoted learning about the history of what happened within our country, and how innovation is eluding us, what we can do to overcome these. In fact, the slides which I have sent, I had a much more ambitious plan, but I knew the time given to me not much and not enough. This actually qualifies.
Yeah. So we'll do this again, sir, because this is we'll do it again, sir. This is just a beginning we've made. We'll do it again, sir.
I think why don't you arrange a symposium on on the history itself? See, the problem with India is that we give completely we don't respect the history element in our education.
Very right.
We disregard.
Very
So I think that's very important. Yeah.
So there are a couple of
There are,
queries in the chat box as well. If you
yeah.
permit, I will read the questions from our
Please,
attendee.
please.
Yes,
I'd
sir.
love
Thank
to
you.
that.
Yeah. So there is one query from Dr. Prasuna. What is your suggestion on directing drug research and development based on the Indian needs, Indian health scenario needs?
Yes.
Would it?
Yeah. See, Indian needs in the sense, I told you what Sudeep Chowdhury did was to address a query from WHO about what India can do towards neglected diseases.
Correct.
Here again, it's the market that will decide. When there is no market, there will be no innovation. Even when there is innovation, if there is no market, there cannot be an innovation. So finally, I think the government has to step in certain issues where profit is not the purpose. The government has to step. Welfare. You see what's happening to US. US is not doing too well in healthcare, although they
Yes.
are investing the great deal of money in it.
Mm.
It's helping the corporations, it's helping the drug pharma and all those industries. But are they really helping the patient? Not really so,
People.
because the capitalist model doesn't seem to work
Mm.
appropriately in healthcare. Because there's a conflict of interest. See,
Agreed.
the conflict of interest of the pharma company is that for the company, the shareholder is important, and for the medicine, the patient is important. But when the
Mm.
company gives more importance to the shareholder than the patient, the conflict of interest becomes very fundamental, and this is creating a lot of problems in our
Mm.
industry. So you can't do much. You have to just
Yeah.
live with it. I think
Yeah,
the model.
it's unfortunate that economic muscle is more important than science, but that's the truth.
Definitely,
We have
yeah.
to live with so many bitter truths, and I think this is one of them. So there is one more query from Dr. Sridevi. She wants to know how we should move forward, at least in the herbal drug discovery scenario, with the basic needs we have and with whatever government initiatives that are available. Is it possible that if not in the drug disc in the synthetic drug market, can we make headways in the herbal, which is again not very trusted from
Yeah,
India?
actually, the what we should not do is isolate the compound.
Okay.
So I think even today, I think Raoul extract can sell as a BP medicine,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but somehow there is this suspicion that the herbal medicine is not good enough. Of course, it's coming back in a certain way. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
medicines are making a marketable kind of presence they have. I don't know. There's something called Pankaja Kasturi in Kerala.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. It's for
I
respiratory.
think proprietary medicines will have a position because a lot of these allopathic medicines are also harmful. They
Yeah,
produce a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
side
yeah, yeah, yeah.
conclusions. So I think what we need to do is we should promote. See, you go to any other
Mm,
country, there will be a very strong herbal medicine segment in
mm,
mainstream healthcare. But
mm,
for us, it is not within the mainstream healthcare. It's always a
mm.
peripheral.
Periphery. Mm.
We have to bring them into the mainstream, and that is probably, I think government is trying to do something, Ayush and all that,
Yeah, yeah.
but finally, perception happen on the man on the street, so he has to
Mm,
get convinced. Also.
mm. So it's like we have to build more marketing muscle into the Ayurvedic.
Yes, finally, it's all product.
Mm.
Medicine is different from a medical product. It has to be available in the market. It has to be properly priced. It should be expensive also. In fact, there's a story I would like to remember. I always quote the story. One of my friends, uh, had a maid, and that lady developed diabetes, symptoms
Mm.
of diabetes. So she said, "Why don't you go and meet this doctor? He's a good friend of mine."
Mm.
Sent her to the doctor. The doctor examined her and gave her two medicines and said, "You go and take this regularly, come back after a month." So when the patient came back after a month, the blood sugar was still very high. No, there was
Okay.
absolutely no
No
control.
signs of.
So asked her, "What happened? Are you not taking the medicines?" I said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir. Come on, show me the medicine." And she pulled out one medicine, and that was the vitamin pill. Actually, the doctor prescribed metformin and a vitamin pill. The vitamin
Okay.
pill was expensive and the metformin was cheap. So she thought the expensive thing mattered.
It's going to work.
So the perception is replayed. So it's only when something is expensive, it's got value. So these are all notions we have to change. I quote the story very often to
Yeah,
explain
yeah.
how even a poor
Person
patient who
thinks
cannot
that,
afford
yeah, that what is expensive could be good for you. Yeah.
these are all notions
Very
we have to.
nice. No, maybe this COVID has some benefits there, because I think Chawanprash and all those, lot of Ayurvedic products
Yeah,
are
maybe.
picking up probably, and they might then last on, because now we'll always be worried. So, okay.
Thank you. That's very true also for that
Mm.
point which you. It might. I mean, anyway, I don't have any clear idea about how
Yeah,
things will
yeah,
emerge after the
correct.
situation becomes now.
Mm.
Yeah. And also, if you can send me the link of this, it'll be nice, so that I can send it to some people
Oh,
who might
sure,
be
sir. The
interested.
recording, na? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We'll surely share it with you, sir. Yes, sir. Surely, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We,
Any
we
more
will also be
questions?
having it on our website probably, but we will send it to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. And any more questions, please?
So that's all that is there in the chat box. Some message, sir, I wanted you for, how our, future generations can probably, come out of this mucky situation, and when they are entrepreneurs or when they are into drug discovery, is there any chance that, we can upturn the situation and show what we stand, what
Oh,
we can do?
I think, see, I was talking to one of my students in Bangalore. He was
Hmm.
saying that some of his friends have come together. They have started
Yeah,
they have a startup now in
correct.
which they are taking up projects from big companies.
Okay.
That's a real thing for India to do.
Hmm.
Startups in India can, if they have a good background, have worked
Hmm.
in very good research units
Hmm. Hmm.
with their
Hmm.
contacts, they can
Correct. They can.
actually,
Hmm.
everything is becoming expensive now.
Hmm.
So always this move to a cheaper place. So
Hmm.
India can attract, when it
Hmm.
comes to
Correct.
money, we
Hmm.
can provide very good services at very low rates because our
Hmm.
human resources are world class.
Hmm.
So these startups, I think, will become a viable unit in
Hmm.
because now they have a lot of funds also.
Hmm.
They have enough funds for the coming 3 years. If they generate some molecule,
Then
and
they're
you
there.
can never say,
Correct. Oh yes,
yeah, yeah.
surely, sir.
These are all,
Yes, sir.
and also I see startups of this type. Not only in this, a lot of CR. One other student of mine is, started a clinical research unit.
Startup.
Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
Supposed to help discovery groups.
Correct.
And of course, this COVID has come in the way of a lot of these
Hmm.
innovators
Hmm.
developing,
Yeah,
things.
it's taking things backward a little bit here.
But I
Hmm.
think it will clear up after a while, and
Hmm.
this can be ended.
Yeah, very right, sir. Right, sir. I think what message you have for the youngsters, that they have to gain the correct kind of experience, and then think of going out on their own and having their own entrepreneurial ventures, because the
Yeah,
startup bug bites a lot of kids these days. So I think that's a beautiful message that you've conveyed, that they should first learn the skill, and then
yeah.
once they have the contacts and all that, they can really try and do something about drug discovery from India. I think that's a wonderful
See,
message.
now it is very easy to divide the task into components and
Correct. Now,
to different people. So the ancillarization is also hit the knowledge industry.
yes,
So you
yes,
do
yes.
this, you do this, you do this, you do that.
Mm,
And in that kind of situation, the specialization improves, the
mm,
efficiency is better, cost effective too. So I
mm,
think India, especially professionals who have the background, can definitely consider. I used to sometimes think that I must join some kind of a consultancy or something like that.
mm,
But I
mm,
don't have an industry background, so not many godfathers to pick me up.
mm.
So, recently the Divis, yeah, you might have read about Divis. They have touched 9 billion or something like that. So, it's just a student from Manipal who is now created a world of himself, world by himself. So
Mm.
these are all possible because entrepreneurship is very much, especially Andhra people. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. So there is one more query here, which is our Indigenous Advisory Board to help hoist herbal formulations on the international platform. Is there something like that? And if
I'm
it is
sorry,
there,
these
how
are
do you approach it?
I'm very sorry. I think Ayush is the
Yeah.
community you have to talk to.
Hmm.
Ayush must be quite, having these. I'm not very sure about the funding and things like that because I have not myself availed any of it.
Hmm.
It's very difficult to get funds once you're retired because
Hmm.
they don't trust you. They'll run away with the money. So
Very right. Hmm.
I'm sure there are many companies. There are many venture capitalists. Remember that.
Okay.
Sitting on a lot of money, they don't know what to do with the money. So they're
Correct.
looking for opportunities through people, who can innovate. So I think what you should do is, see, in fact, one of my students had created a formulation which he started selling locally and all that,
Okay.
and now trying to develop further to the next step. It's possible, I'm sure. It's possible.
Okay. Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much for all the insights you have given and so much of, I think, very inspirational. And I'm sure our youngsters will take some clue and get on, and we'll all read the book, sir.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you
Thank you
very,
very
very
much.
much.
Yeah. Okay. Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
It's a privilege to listen to you, sir. It's a privilege, always.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
I want to thank you for sparing your time.
Oh,
We
thank you very
started it
much
on a
for the
Tuesday because
opportunity.
it was convenient to you.
Oh, yes, it was very convenient.
because
Thank you very much.
because this is the first time I wouldn't think of starting with anyone else but Dr. Unnikrishnan.
Thank
you
you for
very
the
much, sir. Thank
flattery.
you.
Thank you for
Thank you
flattery.
very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
God bless you.